That's not me. Okay, well, welcome, folks, and I'll be watching for people who will join as we go. So really thrilled to have Mike Boudreau and Bonnie Huskins here. They have both spoken to our society in the past, and Bonnie's spoken at least once in this topic, maybe twice. I kind of lose track, but they've always done well and drawn a good crowd. And so this is their recent book, which I think they were interviewed by CBC when the book came out a few weeks ago. And I understand there's an article in the paper today. So so I think what we'll do, I'll just turn things over. And we have like an hour and a half booked. We don't have to use the full time. On the other hand, if we want to go a bit longer, Zoom will keep ticking, right? So you can ask questions. We'd like your questions at the end, presenters, for the most part. Yeah, and you can put questions in the chat because you guys can see the chat too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So we'll just, it's not a huge group. We'll watch for new additions, and here's another one. Evelyn's coming in. So we'll just turn things over to our presenters, and welcome to the online New Brunswick Historical Society. I'm going to mute my mic, and you might want to do that too if you're not speaking, just so you don't get any bandwidth or interference issues or whatever. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Greg. Everyone can hear me, I hope. So Bonnie and I will do sort of a tag team presentation for the next little bit. Thank you everyone for attending. We'd like to thank the New Brunswick Historical Society and Greg in particular for this invitation. It's wonderful to talk about Ida and St. John. We'd also like to thank McGill Queen's University Press for publishing the book, and in particular, our acquisitions editor, Kyla Madden. She was with us from day one and has been a very strong supporter of this project. So we'd like to thank her for that. As well, I'd like to give a selfish plug. I have the honor of being the editor of the Journal of New Brunswick Studies, and I would just like to put that on everyone's radar. If it's not already on your radar, it is you can just Google Journal of New Brunswick Studies. All of the articles are free and accessible. You don't have to subscribe. You don't have to be a member of an academic library. And the journal has published a number of key articles on many aspects of New Brunswick society, history, culture, in both official languages, and including, apropos to tonight's discussion on St. John. I'd like to read a quote, and that I think is a nice way to jump off for tonight. And it's a quote that we wish we had for the book, but this is a quote that just was made by the novelist Alan Hollingsworth, and this appeared in the May 27th, 2021 issue of the New York Review of Books. And he was reviewing a series of diaries, and he made what we think is a wonderful statement that, again, we would have loved to have had and used in the book, but I'll just use it tonight. Quote, "The unfolding of a diary is always an adventure, a novel in which the writer has no prior knowledge of the plot," unquote. I think that's very nicely sums up in some ways what a diary is and a diarist. So I'll turn things over to Bonnie.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Bear with me here while I figure out this technology. All right, can everybody see that? Okay, we thought where we would start today is tell you a little bit about the origins of the diary. In other words, who is the diarist, and a bit about the nature of the diaries. So this is a picture of our young diarist, Ida Martin. So I'll tell you a little bit about the diarist first. Ida was the 7th of 10 children born to Simon Peter Friars and Louisa Maud Lockhart. She was born on the 18th of July, 1907 at McGregor Brook, just a few miles north of Sussex. When her dream of becoming a nurse didn't pan out, she became a telephone operator in Westfield. On the 12th of November, 1932, she married Alan Robert Martin, or AR, as he's known in our diaries. In February 1936, their only child, Barbara, was born. And that's my mom, and she's here in the presentation today. When Barbara was 4 years old, the family moved to St. John, where they resided for much of their lives, eventually buying a ramshackle house at 213 Queen Street West, where they spent much of their lives repairing it and renovating it. Ida began keeping diaries on the 10th of August, 1945, 13 years into her marriage. Now, why did she start keeping a diary? We're not 100% sure. It could have been a birthday gift, as her birthday was in July. Or it could have been a travel diary, as she was going to visit her sister Marguerite a little bit after she purchased this diary. So we're not 100% sure why she started. Regardless, she kept them faithfully for 47 years. Now, she didn't personally articulate why she kept the diaries so faithfully. In an interview with a local newspaper, she simply said, "I simply had to write in them every day." Now I'm just going to change the image here. I want to tell you a little bit about the nature of these diaries. Now, there's lots of different conventions of diary writing that we go over in the book. For example, in the 1500s, the literary classes used diaries to record their travels. In the 17th century, religious dissenters used diaries to chronicle their conversion experiences. By the 19th century, middle-class women used diaries to write about family and domesticity. By the 20th century, we start to get the journal that's more familiar to us, a journal with lock and key, where we're more introspective and where we share our innermost thoughts and feelings. Ida's diaries were not like this. They were 4 to 5 line accounts of the daily rhythms of life. In some ways, they're much more reminiscent of 18th and 19th century work diaries, which combine the traditions of the account book, the almanac, the daybook, and so on. So she mainly used 4 or 5 lines a day, which is all she had in her 5-year diary, to record family, neighborhood, church, community, and so on. Now, one thing we have noticed over time in the diaries, over the course of the 47 years, is that the diaries do become thicker over time, both literally and figuratively, as Ida starts to record aspects of the larger world around her. Now, ranging from the constitutional debates, she was really interested in constitutional history, also the space race, the Olympics, and so on, just about everything. Now, these 5-year commercial diaries that she used, we have a series of 10 of them. And because you only have 4 to 5 lines to record what you want to record, she uses what some have called intensive writing, where you really pack a lot of information into just a few words. So Michael and I had to spend a lot of time really decoding the language and the vocabulary of the diaries. We had to pay attention to the words that she used, to the punctuation, to handwriting, and other cues. Now, as I mentioned, these were not really overly introspective as sources. She didn't share a lot about her feelings or her emotions, but she did find ways to integrate them into the diaries. And my favorite ways, the favorite way that I have is through parentheses. And my favorite example is from the Christmas of 1962. That is when they finally took her mother-in-law home after spending Christmas. So she dutifully records that in the diary, and then in parentheses says, a sigh of relief. Right? So she does find ways to integrate how she's feeling about things. Now, some literary critics argue that because these diaries are so much about daily life, they're mundane and they're not important. But we argue that it's the very dailiness of these diaries, their very ordinariness, which is why they're so historically significant. So I think that's where I will stop for a minute, and I'll hand it back over to Michael.
Perfect. So, and of course, I'll put this up and hopefully everyone can see it. This is actually the book itself, and the cover. McGill Queen's University Press does, I think, a wonderful job at putting books together and designing books in particular. So what we're going to do as well is read a few excerpts from the diaries, just to contextualize some of Ida's thoughts, and also to allow, because part of what we'd hope with this presentation and part of what we hope with the book is that, yes, it is a window into the diarist, but it is also a window into St. John. So, for example, here are a couple of quotes, and through Bonnie mentioned earlier, Alan Robert, the A, or referred to as AR, throughout the diaries. He was a longshoreman. But here are a few excerpts from the diaries. AR left home at noon and returned at 6 a.m. I walked the floor all night. AR and no one is mentioned in this one. It's just a line. AR and out being bad. And of course, bad, I think we've been able to determine, was drinking. AR and his companions were mad about the way of being paid, and mad about the way of being paid is all in caps, because it does reveal the labor strife that occurred in the port of St. John. And indeed, they had many reasons to be upset with either their wages, their poor wages, their abilities to actually get their wages. At one point, when part of the port was taken over by a company from outside of the region, they sent their checks to the other St. John in Newfoundland as opposed to St. John, New Brunswick. Needless to say, they were not impressed. A man fell down the hatch and hurt. Alan got his head hurt with a flying gurney. So these were some of Ida's ways of capturing what we describe as working class masculinity on the ports. And that is unique. There is a rich literature on working class masculinity, but often from a man's perspective, not often from a woman's perspective. And these diaries really show that. But they also show the importance of the union, the International Longshoremen's Association, Local 273, and the importance of the union in terms of providing decent wages and benefits for for families, and also how difficult it was to be a longshoreman. Ida records numerous accidents that AR suffered on the job over the course of his life, and numerous injuries that his co-workers also faced. This was a dangerous job. And in one sense, that danger did breed a sense of rugged masculinity. There was also a lot of drinking that occurred in one sense to alleviate that pain, but also to reinforce that sense of working class masculinity as well. I mean, AR put in for his pension at age of 67, and as Ida recorded in his diaries, he was, quote, just wore out. Indeed, his job as a longshoreman in St. John literally wore him out. And you can see the images that Bonnie has put up, this of the Port of St. John itself. It was and remains a key economic driver for the city. Some would argue right now that we are seeing a renaissance or a revival of the Port of St. John, and this is going to have a positive effect upon the city's and arguably the province's economy. Not to say that St. John lived and died, or at least its economy lived and died by the port, but it was a key industry, and people like AR were central to the success of that industry and the economic spin-offs that St. John enjoyed from the port. So I'll turn it back over to Bonnie.
All right, here I am. I'm also going to start by reading a little bit from the diaries themselves. And I'm taking these quotes from the diary from our chapter 3 of the book, which is called Dump Trucks and Chevys, Gender, Class, and Motor Vehicles in Working Class Life and Culture. Got dump truck welded, and AR's eyes were sore from watching. I went to Edna Crawford's tonight, the Chevy and I. AR tinkering with the car, did something to the brake drum, lost brake fluid, terrible day, in capital letters. Alan and blank, speeding out at Purdy's. Couldn't drive at all with AR in the car. Now, I wanted us to include this chapter in our discussion today because it's probably the most surprising chapter for us. It's not something I would have presupposed would occur in the diaries, but the diaries were just chock full of references to motor vehicles. They could be the cars, the new cars that friends and family obtained or new to them. And also, Ida kept track of all the dump trucks that AR used for odd jobbing and when he worked for Stevens Construction in St. John. So motor vehicles make a really impressive presence in the diaries. But what sense do we make of this? You know, why are motor vehicles everywhere in the entries of the diary? Well, we think part of it is because of the significance of the motor vehicles in the family economy of the Martins. So these dump trucks in particular were really important sources of income for the family. So frequently, Ida Martin would keep track of which dump truck was in the backyard, what kind of mechanical shape it was in, and she used the diaries to diagnose what was mechanically wrong with the vehicles. And my mom, Barbara, has memories of both Ida and Alan in the middle of the night down in the backyard with their heads over the motor of the various dump trucks, trying to figure out what was wrong with it, and Ida assisting AR to do this. So it was certainly an important aspect of their family economy. And indeed, trucking was also a means of earning a living for Ida's brothers as well. R.E. and J.E. Friars eventually formed a company called R.E. and J.E. Friars, who specialized in dry bulk freight. So certainly motor vehicles play a really important role in the family economy. But there's also gendered associations and status associations that come along with owning a motor vehicle. And when we look at the literature, we frequently see an association between motor vehicles and masculinity. So we were really interested to see that Ida herself keeps track of these vehicles. that she diagnoses what is wrong with them. She also uses her diaries to critique what she views as the worst excesses of what we call in the book motor vehicle masculinity. In other words, AR's reckless driving. Now, in the chapter that we have in the book about life in the port, we have a section on the propensity of longshoremen to engage in risk-taking behavior. And this is a similar kind of focus in working class masculinity. But what you see here is Ida's perspective, a working class woman's perspective on this form of working class masculinity. Another aspect of this chapter is that we see the car in particular becoming a source of mobility for Ida. Like a lot of women of her generation, she didn't receive her driving license until the age of 53 in 1962. So in the diaries, we see how nervous she was trying to learn how to drive with AR in the car with her. She did much better when she took driver's lessons from someone else. But she persisted. And you can really get a sense in the diaries of how much she enjoyed the mobility that came with learning how to drive herself. Now, after AR was responsible for a major accident with Ida in the car at Long Reach in 1982, Ida became the sole driver. And all of this is really ironic because a lot of recent studies show that women are actually better and safer drivers than men and actually have more stamina for long distance trips in the car. So it's kind of interesting that they are often labeled as the so-called nervous woman driver. Okay, I think I will hand it over to Michael again.
Wonderful. Greg, in answer to your question, I noticed in the chat the image from the port, I believe, was from 1956. That photo that we have of the port of St. John, and you could see just how massive it was in terms of the city landscape. So 1956.
Oh, could I just add something too? I'd like to thank Harold Wright for allowing us to use innumerable images of the port and longshoremen. So I just wanted to mention that if Harold's in the audience there.
Indeed, indeed. So now picking up on that theme of vehicles, it also speaks to the working class family economy. And I think part of one of the chapters that we have discusses getting by in post-war St. John and how difficult, despite the rise of the welfare state, it was to live on a day-to-day basis in St. John. Again, a few excerpts from the diaries. Did Saturday's work, just the usual work, hence the title of the book. Usual Monday's work, just right out straight. Busy as a bee. AR just puttering around. So again, perhaps a subtle or perhaps a not so subtle dig at AR puttering around, and as Bodhi mentioned earlier, tinkering with automobiles as well. But the working class family economy, which is a theme that one of the themes that sort of anchors the book is this notion of change and continuity. And we often think of a working class family economy as something that's very steeped in the 19th century, but it continued into the 20th century. It continued, more importantly, into the post-1945 period when we see the rise of the welfare state. And that's not to downplay the welfare state. It did play a central role in many working class families' lives, in particular Ida's and AR's life in terms of supplementing their income, but they still needed to piece things together. So AR did many jobs. Yes, his primary source of income was as a longshoreman at the port, but he also was a truck driver. And he worked later for Stevens Construction and Paving. And even there, as Bonnie mentioned, he engaged in some reckless driving behavior using the company's vehicles. He also engaged in what Ida called treeing. In other words, he would cut down Christmas trees, perhaps illegally, on private and crown land, and sell them at King's Square in uptown St. John as a way, again, to earn an extra income. Because of course the port was not a year-round port, so they had to put together different forms of jobs in order to make ends meet. They were not poor, but they were also not middle class either. Ida, who Bonnie mentioned earlier, dreamed of being a nurse. That dream unfortunately did not come through, but she did work for a telephone company. Then she worked for Beck's Dry Cleaning. And we see through Ida the fact that by 1951 in St. John, women comprised 30% of the city's paid labor force. So women were playing a key role, as they were in other cities as well. But I think that's the point that we're trying to make. We're not necessarily saying that St. John is unique, but it has been forgotten, if not overlooked, in some of the histories of working class Canada. And it's important, I think, for us to put St. John on that map again, to highlight the fact that even though we have a welfare state, the working class family economy was very important. Ida also took in boarders, paying rent, another way to supplement their income over a 12-month period. So I think I'll turn it back over to Bonnie.
Okay, I'm just going to share one more image with you. Just bear with me here while there she is.
And Bonnie, while you're doing that, I think I see a great question from Moira in terms of reckless driving. And yes, it was, I think, acceptable in many ways, at least. And you're right, in Vancouver it was. So I would argue it was perfectly acceptable.
Yes, I think so too. I think it was a very important part of working class masculinity. And many argue too in the literature that that kind of reckless driving also emanates from rural masculinity, and that you weren't a man unless you drove a car really fast and almost in an accident of sorts. So it's part of that that risk-taking behavior that that many historians now have associated with the working class man. Yeah, that's a great question. We also have a chapter in the book on aging and textual representations of aging in the diaries. And this is one of my favorite images of my grandmother. She's in her apartment at Hillcrest Village. And you can see in the background, there's a picture of me, her granddaughter, in my graduation robes from Mount Allison University. So in the diaries, we definitely get a sense of the experience of aging. I think the diaries are a good insight into widowhood, into how hard it was to leave the conjugal home at 213 Queen Street when she could no longer care for it herself. Moving into her apartment at Hillcrest Village. I mean, she initially was very resistant to this, but eventually came to love her time at Hillcrest Village and the sense of community that it provided. And I think my mom and dad feel the same thing about Hillcrest Village even today. And then, of course, her move into Seeley's nursing home in Martinon. And again, that was a difficult transition. But the people at Seeley's nursing home were so wonderful to her and created such a sense of family that it really made the experience of aging a little easier, I think, on Ida and on the entire family. What I'd like to focus on, though, is what the diaries reveal about this more specifically. And I'd like to highlight one interesting aspect of this, and that is the shared authorship of the diaries between Graham, my grandmother, and my mother, Barbara. So as Ida aged and became too ill, too frail to keep daily entries, what you start to see is Barbara taking over as diarist sometimes. So when Graham was incapacitated in the hospital, Barbara took over and she actually took on the voice of Ida and tried to capture what Ida must have been feeling if she could have kept those entries. Now we also have Barbara and Ida becoming a tag team where Ida starts the entry and then she just can't finish it. Barbara comes in and finishes the entry for her. So you can see in the diaries that we have two different examples of handwriting, but essentially it's a mother-daughter duo here. And this provides, we think, a really interesting insight into diaries, because we often assume that diaries are intensely private documents, right? Our innermost thoughts and feelings, lock and key. But historians are now showing us that even going back as early as the 19th century, that friends and family often wrote in each other's diaries. They read each other's diaries and they wrote in each other's diaries. So we think the shared authorship that's most evident in the aging chapter is really something that's quite interesting. Now, in more recent years, Barbara herself has started to keep a journal, trying to keep that tradition alive. I've tried. I just don't have the self-discipline to be able to do that. But I view my contribution to this project as my contribution to a larger life writing exercise. I just like to share the framework of life writing with you for a minute here. Life writing, it's a multidisciplinary framework that focuses not only on the authorship of a piece, so not just on, say, the diarist, but also on those individuals with a relationship to the diarist who engage in, quote, autobiographical acts involved in the collection of oral histories and archival accounts. So it's a larger life writing exercise, not only involving, say, the diarist, but everybody else involved in trying to make sense of that diary. So this kind of framework enables collaboration in two different forms. One is intergenerational collaboration. So that's the collaboration between Ida as the diarist, my mom as a journalist in her own right, and helping us to make sense of her mother's diaries, and then myself for my contributions to this larger project. But it also enables collaboration in terms of the partnership between Michael and I. In life writing and in feminist praxis, a key tenet is you're always negotiating between the position of insider and outsider. Now, in this project, I'm the insider. I'm the granddaughter, and I have an intimate knowledge that not everybody else will have in trying to make sense of these diaries. But it may also blind me to some of the insights that social distance can bring. So enter Michael, who brings a broader theoretical and historiographical context to the project. And he helps me to better appreciate the complexity of Ida. She is a grandmother, and an awfully good one, but also a very complex historical character. Now, before I turn it back to Michael, I just want to clarify that those robes that I'm wearing there, I don't know why I said Mount A, those are actually my doctoral robes. So my grandmother actually supported me throughout my BA, MA, and PhD, as did my parents. So with that, Michael, I'll hand it back over to you.
Perfect. And just a few concluding thoughts. Yes, because I remember your grandmother was very proud to be able to buy
Yes.
your PhD robes
Yes.
for you from that other university known as Dalhousie. I'm not sure where that is, but it's nowhere near Queens. So that's all I know. So that's an inside joke. Sorry, folks. But just a few concluding remarks, and just to reiterate a point that I made earlier. We hope that the book is obviously about diaries and Ida and AR and Barbara, but it's also about St. John. St. John has a rich history, and I'm not saying anything that this group doesn't know, but we really hope to promote the history of the post-World War II history of St. John, because really, as you'll see, and even hopefully from this evening, but then throughout the book, it was quote unquote ordinary, but also quote unquote extraordinary people like Ida, like AR, who helped to build St. John. Yes, corporations played a role, and that unnamed corporation, which everyone knows, that dominates the city of St. John, yeah, of course it played a role, but so too did these so-called ordinary and extraordinary people, because we see them as, yes, ordinary. They saw themselves, I think, as ordinary, and we're certainly not trying to romanticize them. Romanticizing the past is always, I think, a dangerous thing, because then we blind ourselves to some of the realities of the past. So we cannot romanticize how difficult life was for them. But while they were ordinary, they were, I think, extraordinary at the same time. And I think Bonnie would agree. And one final plea and pitch to everyone: search your attics, search your basements for diaries. A number of people who are here this evening have worked with diaries: Catherine Gidney, Janet Mullen, and others. We need to, and especially post-World War II diaries. These are rich historical sources, and we need to delve into them more, so for what they can reveal, not just about daily life or not just about families, but about the broader society in which those diaries were written. Because Ida was a product of her time, but she also reflected those times as well. The one thing I forgot to mention in the working class family economy, despite the rise of the welfare state and modern technology, they clung to the household goods that they had. They didn't necessarily see the need to purchase something new for the sake of having something new. If a washing machine could be fixed, they fixed it. They believed that it would last longer than something that was new and more expensive. So while modernity still definitely played a role in post-World War II St. John, it wasn't always the case for some working class families. So I would like to say thank you. And I think we're happy to answer any and all questions as easy. We'll try to answer them as honestly as possible, or we'll just turn
We'll
our
make
mics
something
off,
up.
or we'll turn our mics off and pretend that we don't know how to turn our mics back on if we don't know the answer. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you very much, especially in these uncertain times.
Thank you, Michael, and Bonnie. So maybe we'll just, do this sort of informally. People can either put up their golden handshakes or just turn their mics on or ask a question by chat. I think we'll just let the presenters handle the questions. And but if there's any gaps, as the academics know, an historian will fill them quite quickly. So yeah, anyway. So I don't know if you guys want to look at the chat, or if anyone wants to raise a question, just go ahead and turn your mic on if you want to talk, please.
I haven't seen the chats. I haven't had it on. So
Okay.
is there anything from the chat that that somebody would like to ask now in
Yeah, I
person?
see. Well, I do see something from, let's see, I'm looking at them now. Then, Greg, this was an earlier question you had before. Is the writings by historians on teenagers, young women keeping diaries in the mid 20th century? Cynthia Camacho has done a little bit on that, but we don't say much about that in the book. And then how long did it take for the book to come out? Oh goodness, far too long.
Oh,
So it's been, I
yeah.
mean, it's probably from start to finish, probably about 5 years in terms of going through peer review,
Mm.
responding to the reviewers' comments, going through aid to scholarly publishing, then making all of the changes. I mean, the irony is that um, all of this came together fortunately when I was on sabbatical when COVID first hit in 2019. So while Bonnie had to pivot from teaching in class to teaching
Yeah.
online, I was free and easy. And because I was on sabbatical. So, and that's just literally when we were receiving things like copy editing, page proofs, indexing, all of that stuff. So luckily, I was able to do that, because if I hadn't been on sabbatical and with COVID
Mm.
first hitting, this may not have seen the light of day as quickly as it did. So yeah, but we've been thinking about this
Oh, yeah.
for about 10 years at least. I mean,
Oh, at least.
and
Yeah.
as many of you know, we have other articles that have appeared prior to this, but the actual writing itself, probably about 5 years off and on. A labor of love, nonetheless.
We have like almost an entire filing cabinet worth of notes and so on from the diaries. So yeah, it's been a long time in coming. There's a lot of stuff that didn't make its way into the diary, into the book, sorry. So there's lots of other things, you know, that we could have made more of, but you just can't include everything. So one aspect I think should be mentioned that we really didn't dissect in the presentation, but it's in the book, is the importance of faith for Ida. And we think probably that her Baptist faith was probably one of the reasons why she kept diaries for so long. It's that idea of, you know, an accounting for a life well lived. And, you know, there are many other reasons why she kept diary, but the importance of faith in her life, her role in the church, and first at Charlotte Street Baptist Church that some of you may know from the west side of St. John, and then Hillcrest United Baptist Church, very, very important parts of her life.
Bonnie, I'm also reading a very fascinating question here from Moira. So you mentioned aging and how Ida moved to different places as she became less capable of living independently, but you didn't mention whether she herself spoke about aging or how she felt about it. I'm wondering how ageist her times were compared to today, and whether she saw herself as better off or worse off as she aged.
Maybe mom and dad can jump in here too as well, but what I remember the most, and I think it comes through in the book a little bit, is that Graham became very frustrated by the fact that aging took away some of her capabilities, right? That her life was a life of very hard work, right? From sun up to sundown. She always felt like she had to be working, didn't she, Mom? All the time. And when she wasn't working, she felt like she should be working. So the fact that age took away, you know, that capability to work as hard as she did, I think that is one thing that comes through very clearly. Let's see. How else could I?
She does speak about the one thing that is very poignant in this context is she does when AR died. So even though the diaries are not, as Bonnie mentioned, introspective, that was, you could see how that affected her. And the homes that she lived in, so if we compare that, and we didn't do this in the book because we didn't really, because COVID was just starting, but we see the devastating effect that COVID has had on long-term care facilities, and how we've basically just throw the aged out the window, and people realize, oh, you mean there are all these older people who are suffering and dying in these places. And even arguably when COVID first started, people said, oh, well, it's only old people who are dying, so right, we don't care about the aged because we institutionalize them. Well, from what we can gather, at least the places where Ida moved to when she was older and could no longer live on her own, they seemed to be positive places. They seem to treat her with a great deal of respect. And some of the workers, I think, even adopted her as their Graham. So I mean, that's only one example. So I don't know how the experiences of others, but yeah, at least that would be my take on some of this.
I could also, now that I'm thinking about it, one other aspect of this is thinking back on the diaries. I think what was the hardest part of all in the aging process for Ida was giving, well, not the hardest, but one of the hardest, aside from not being able to work as hard as she always had, was to leave 213 Queen Street initially, right? I mean, widowhood was devastating. You know, she started to lose all of her brothers and sisters at the same time too. They call that cohort attrition, because they were all coming of an age, and she was starting to see them all die. It almost seemed like overnight. So that was very difficult on her. But leaving that house, on the one hand, she was terrified to be there alone. So she had Carl Conrad, a local guy, a friend of my brother's, come and stay with her for a while. But you know, she just couldn't keep the house up. She still wanted to be there. So that transition from the house that you spent your whole life in renovating, fixing it up, and then transitioning out of that house. You know, that was one of the very few parts of the diary where she actually said, and I quote, "My mind is in a turmoil." And that's very introspective for her to say that.
I think Barb has something you wanted to add to that, do you?
Yes.
Speak with that.
When I looked at the name of the book, Just the Usual Work, I was involved in that usual work beginning on Saturday morning at 8 o'clock. I would have to be outdoors, shining the doorbell and the letter slot, and every step had a piece of metal, and I had to do that. This went on all morning for me on a Saturday. And so I was part of just the usual work.
That's right. It's about the whole family. It's not just Ida, right?
Yeah.
So AR had the
a lot of
things he had to do.
I just wanted to add one little small detail. You mentioned Seeley's Lodge. When she entered Seeley's Lodge, that was actually a special care home. But when she got to the point of requiring nursing care, they elected to keep her anyway because they enjoyed her so much. And actually, she was the first client that they had when they opened the home there. And then just a note on the frugality. When AR would paint that house, Bon, you remember it was brown, right? And it was a water-based paint. He would add more water, and he would get about 2 gallons of paint out of 1 gallon and paint the house. I helped him paint some parts of it. And of course, 12 months later, it would be peeling off again. And he would say, "They don't make paint like they used to." I thought, no, they don't.
Do you remember Dad too, where he always was tarring the roof all the time, just tarring the roof constantly?
Yeah.
Bonnie, there's a question. Mike,
the odd leak would crop up there once in a while. Tar the roof.
There's a question from Christy, Bonnie and Mike.
Hi, thank you. I've really enjoyed the book and I've really enjoyed the talk. And I want to thank you for helping me better understand my adopted home. It's been a lovely treat. I don't know if the first thing I want to say is a comment or a question, which is terrible as an academic. So I'm going to just say, I thought it was really interesting that as Ida aged, her descriptions became thicker, became more enriched and more engaged. And I was wondering if you had anything more to say about that. And I just wanted to say that in my own work, which started out on, young men's masculinity and has shifted into old men's masculinity, I've found actually the old to be much more interesting, to have more rich things to say about their lives, be more self-reflexive, more capable. And so it helps sort of affirm my own work to you that I'm not the only one finding that. And secondly, we so often ask men about masculinity, but so rarely understand masculinity through the voices of women. And of course, we know that gender is constructed, in conversation with, in opposition to, but without the support of women, particular kinds of masculinity couldn't exist at all. And I think you can really see that in Ida's stories around the trucks and the care for the trucks and the reckless driving. I'm just wondering if there are things that Ida could say that probably her husband couldn't, and that, that this sort of gives us a unique perspective into working class masculinity when it's not coming from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Absolutely. I'll maybe tackle the first one and Michael can jump in and whatever.
Sure.
No, the way in which the diaries thicken, I think, is really fascinating. I've been trying to figure that out over time. I think one issue is probably that she's becoming a more confident diarist. When she first started out, she was maybe talking about, J.E. came over to visit today, and that might be the only part. But as she got the hang of it, as she became a more confident diarist, I think she started to look around a bit more and thought, okay, well, these other things are also worth recording for my family, for posterity, to create a record. But one of our theories is also that with the rise of mass media, she's becoming a lot more aware of what's going on around her. I mean, she makes references in the diaries to having the radio on in the porch all the time and listening to the radio, having the TV on. Of course, the introduction to television itself, right? That was really important. So she would talk in the diaries about listening to news coverage on the radio or listening to news coverage on the television, watching the constitutional debates or the elections until 3 o'clock in the morning, right? So we kind of theorized that perhaps it's because of the introduction of this mass media that we start to see Ida becoming a more engaged person with the world around her. So that does make a lot of sense to me, because she actually doesn't mention that in the diaries, watching the stuff on television. And then sometimes that becomes a form of action for her. Like she mentions after the constitutional debates that she wrote a letter to each of the premiers about their stand on various issues with regards to those debates. So that would be my first kick at the can. We never found the letters, unfortunately.
No, unfortunately, yeah, that would have been fantastic. And to pick up from that, and then also, Chrissy, then to answer your second question, one of the reviewers for the manuscript asked us if Ida read Chatelaine, and why we didn't discuss that, and we sort of addressed that in our response to the reader, and it was a curious comment, because Chatelaine in especially in the 1960s was still very much a middle class publication, but working class women did read it, and it was part of that broader focus on, well, what is women's liberation? And Chatelaine tried to make somewhat of a contribution to that. And they had some interesting articles and debates in Chatelaine. But from our perspective, I don't think would have ever desired to read it, because she would have seen it as a waste of money, right? To subscribe to a magazine. Who has time to sit around and read a magazine when you, as Bonnie said earlier, you have to be working. Because so that's the importance of radio and television. You can still have the radio on and still be working as well. Part of me wishes that AR had have kept a diary as well. And to one of the questions in the chat, I don't think he ever did read the diaries. Other members of the family did read. Other members of the family did read the diaries, but AR himself did not. But sometimes there are examples where, again, through Ida's words, AR is also reflecting on his working class masculinity. And it's very similar, Christy, to your research, where as he ages, he's starting to realize that he's not he wasn't the same man as he used to be, because of the injuries that he's suffering from the port. And literally it's taking its toll, and he recognizes that. And there was we have one great instance from the diary where he's walking home and he's just not feeling well. I mean, and he can barely keep up with his friends. And so he apparently stops and he's just enjoying the scenery and enjoying I think it was in the evening. So he's enjoying the stars, and his friends were saying, well, what are you taking so long? Come on, let's get to the tavern, right? We have to. And AR said, oh, I'll be there when I'm there, because he recognizes that it was becoming difficult for him to move about. And he was sort of almost through Ida's eyes, lamenting that. So it's almost a loss of that virility that was part of a working class masculinity as well. You can't work 6 or 7 or 8 hours on the port, sometimes 10 hours, and then go to the tavern and drink all night and then get up the next day and start all over again. Those days are over. And with that, part of that masculine identity also leaves. So you see AR a little bit trying to, again, through Ida's eyes and words, reflect on how his life has changed as a member of the working class.
I think too, what I take out of it sometimes is that she just becomes very exasperated with working class masculinity.
Yeah, indeed.
That from her perspective, working class masculinity makes her life a lot more difficult, right? The risk-taking behavior, his injuries at the port, spending more time with the guys than with family sometimes. I guess for me as granddaughter, I understand the culture that he's coming from, but I also understand Graham's perspective, where this makes her life really hard. She often ended up waiting for him to come home, at 3 a.m, and looking out the window and wondering when he'd be back, kind of thing. So for me, it helps us not to romanticize that working class masculinity as we sometimes do, that it had repercussions for the rest of the family.
Thank you so much.
Might be more chat comments there, guys.
Okay, let's see.
Yes, we have Greg, to one of your questions as well. Yeah, we have talked in the past about how Ida took great pride in clotheslines and making sure that the clotheslines were, and then when they would go on family drives, commenting on other people's clotheslines and how well they were arranged or not. So yes, definitely.
And that, again, as I mentioned to you guys when Bonnie gave that talk, that just made the hair in my neck stand on end, because that's my mother-in-law in the Annapolis Valley. And also the idea of the roguish males who are out getting up to no good, and the woman home looking after the fort. That's a little, I have to be careful, my wife's upstairs, but that's a little bit like my in-laws, because they were more working class, and the men off in that community often had to travel out of the community for work and were away, you know,
Yep.
and so it was certainly, and it's the same era. It's the
Yeah.
same era, right? It's the 40s, 50s, 60s, you know, whatever, right? So there's some overlap. Anyway, everything's autobiographical these days, right? Thanks.
This is Evelyn. I made a comment in chat, and also want to make a comment about clotheslines. I can never, I can never hang clothes to the satisfaction of my mother either on the South Shore of Nova Scotia. You know, upside down pants, upside down shirts. Yeah, and I still can't. So I'm glad she doesn't see how I didn't learn my lesson from her. I just had a question and a comment that I had made in chat. My question is, did Ida ever share, you know, the conflict of raising a child and working? And my comment is, at King's Landing, we also had a series of diaries from Annie Anderson from, I think, Douglas or Kingsclear. I thought they covered the same period, but they're a little earlier and they end a little earlier. But there were these same diaries, these lock diaries, 5-year, 1-year diaries, very cryptic comments because they could only fit them in a certain space, daily activities. I think the only time she really shared deeply was after the loss of her husband. But I read some of them before we donated or transferred them to the provincial archives, but they're very fascinating. And I'm glad that the family had kept them. So yeah, back to my question. I'm just wondering if Ida ever shared the conflict of trying to raise a child and working at the same time.
Well, she only worked sporadically outside of the house. So she worked primarily for Beck's Dry Cleaning. And sometimes she would work, you know, at Beck's itself, but other times she was able to bring home piecework. So that allowed her to be still at home and working on some sewing and alterations for the dry cleaners. But it's a bigger question that I think is addressed with also some of her other relations with friars and so on. There was this habit of sharing labor. For example, Ida would babysit some of the friars' girls if their mother wanted to go out shopping, or Florence would, you know, come and babysit Barbara if Ida had to go out, say, to Beck's Dry Cleaning. So there was this kind of this kinship and exchange of labor that was one of the ways we think that this whole extended family, you know, was able to get by over the course of the post-war period. So yeah, I think there was a you know, a little bit of chat about that, but I think it's even a broader issue when you look at the extended family.
Yeah, that's like I'm thinking of my own mother and my own grandmother and my great grandmother, probably just maybe a generation behind. But my great grandmother balanced child rearing and working outside the home by adopting the community post office in the house. So she could be at home with the children, but yet she was earning a living by being the postmistress. My grandmother went to work in a fish plant when the children were young. My mother took on a lot of the different household chores in response to that, raising her younger brother, helping out. And when I was 4, my mother adopted the same community post office in our home so that she could also raise her children and also have a source of income coming in. So I come from a very long line of women who balance the need for to financially help the family, but made it happen with child rearing. And we all pitched in. You know, I remember attending the post office if my mother had to step out of the house, you know, learning how to give out the mail to different people. So I really, you know, I cherish the memories of these hardworking women that instilled in me to this day the necessary and the privilege and the ability of a woman to leave the house or stay at home, earn an income, and raise the family and balance it all.
Well, I know too, when mom and dad were working or going to school, when dad was going to teachers college and mom was working as well, Ida would be the caretaker for a lot of those years. So essentially, because we lived in two flats, one above the other, um, uh, Ida Martin would simply babysit us. So she certainly enabled mom and dad to get education and work as well.
And Ida also managed the household economy while raising
Mhm.
the while raising a child. She would often make sure that when the checks were being handed out at the port, she was there to receive it, not AR, so that the money would go where it was supposed to go, not to the tavern. So she played a key role in managing that broader household economy as well, and the finances of that. She kept detailed records. We have countless numbers of these small passbooks that Scotiabank used to provide. And she was very diligent in following the family's finances. And to your point too about the provincial archives, we do have all of the diaries in the originals, and we have made arrangements to donate them to the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick, because we want, I think, other people to look at these diaries too, because you can read them in so many different ways, and someone could read them in a much different way than we have, and do much different things with them as well. So they will be housed eventually in the provincial archives.
Yep, when the time is right.
You got a question from Catherine Gidney, your colleague.
Hi. I was just wondering about the writing process and whether you ever had disagreements about any interpretation, and not to put you on the spot, Bonnie, or your parents, but also whether there was ever disagreement about your interpretation and, say, your parents. So trying to write something that, both did justice to your grandmother, but also at the same time kept you true to yourself as a historian as well.
Never had any disagreements whatsoever. We were always on the same page, always read them the same way. Nothing at all. I think the one part that we did struggle with was AR's drinking, and how much, because it was something that troubled Ida deeply, and how much of that should we really go into, because there are still family members who are still alive, and other members of the community who knew them and know Bonnie. So that was a struggle to decide how much of that to reveal, and not to reveal it in a way that, as Bonnie mentioned earlier, to romanticize it as well. So, and then there were a few other cases of their family friends being divorced, and Ida playing a role in helping them try to not put the marriage back together, but trying to help them with a marriage that's dissolving. And is that something that we wanted to? How much of that did we want to include as well? So there was some struggle with that. And then some of the interesting parts were around her faith, because while as an historian, I've studied in another lifetime before I became a criminologist, whatever that is. I studied a lot of Baptist history, and my MA was on Baptist history and social gospel. So to me, it's looking at faith. While I can appreciate the importance of faith, I always view it perhaps more skeptical, than perhaps Ida would have, because for her it was a key part of her life. So I think that was another moment of mild tension, perhaps.
I know mom felt it was hard to read the book, didn't you, Mom? Sometimes. Yeah.
You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I read the masculinity part and I had to put it down. And I mean, I knew these things. I used to get up in the night and see my mom on her knees looking out the bay window, waiting for the truck to come home. And when she saw the lights coming around the corner, she'd run and get in bed and snore, so that he wouldn't know that she cared that much, that she was awake.
Yeah. It's I guess it comes down to the fact that that history isn't always good stories. It's good stories and hard stories.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's hard to tell the hard stories. But for me, it was really, it just opened up my whole world in terms of appreciating mom's life and my grandmother's life and just the whole nature of the extended family in St. John. Like I had no idea how closely intertwined the Friarses were and, all those sorts of things. So yeah, there definitely were tensions along the way, and some of it is hard to read. But at the end of the day, we wanted to show the challenges as well as the good times faced by women like Ida Martin.
And just at least a final comment from me, at least initially, I wanted to integrate more theory around modernity, for example, but I lost that battle. In a good way. It didn't take long to convince me that we didn't need to add more theory around modernity. Not if it overshadowed Ida's words. So yeah, and again, that's just one part. It's back to your original question, Catherine. That was just part of the writing process as well, and bringing, even though we may have been quote unquote trained, both of us as social historians, very different kinds of social historians as well, and different kind of quote unquote training, if you can ever train to be an historian. I always chuckled about that. You can train to be a plumber, but I'm not sure you can train to be a historian, but for lack of a better word. But again, these are debates that we have with colleagues all the time. So yeah, it was part of that writing process. Yeah.
I think we had a bit of a difference of opinion, Michael, on feminist praxis at one point. The degree to which the personal can be integrated into the project. And I think we found like I was all for it because I was going back to the feminist theories of the 1980s where, you should just jettison the whole search for objectivity. Don't worry about it, where everything is autobiographical, go for the subjectivity. But I think with life writing, we were able to balance those two really nicely, where we could integrate the personal, but still also bring in the larger theoretical and historiographical currents. So that's why the partnership was kind of fun, because we were coming at it. I was kind of on the ground level chasing the sources wherever they would take me, but Michael was kind of bringing a much broader perspective to everything, and we married the two together, I think, in a nice way.
I see a question. Oh,
Yes, me. As I was a child and watching what was happening in my home, I began to pray really, really hard as a 9-year-old that my dad would get over this and that he would see the Lord. So year after year after year after year, I did that and nothing was happening. And it was bothering my faith because I thought you prayed and things happened. Anyway, God had a plan. At my wedding, I was sitting there looking my best, and I looked over and my father was dissolved in tears. And from that moment on, he was a different man. And the next morning he said to my mother, "Can I go to church with you?" And that was the end of the booze. So that isn't in the book, but it's such a big answer to the whole story.
Yep.
I don't think he was crying because of who she married, but
No.
this little guy from Nova Scotia.
Thanks, Mom.
From the South Shore of Nova Scotia, no less. Oh, my.
Yes, right on.
All right. Former South chairperson here.
Shelburne County.
Yes, Shelburne County. Go Shelburne County.
Yes, Lockport.
Port Latour.
Oh, okay. Small
Born
world.
and raised.
Okay.
So I see a question in the chat from Greg. So what is next for both of you in terms of research? More on St. John? Well, ironically, well, not really. At least for me, for the moment. Although I am looking at capital punishment cases in New Brunswick, and there are a couple of cases from St. John. So I hope to get to those. So that will be a different view. Right now, I'm just trying to struggle with the George and Rufus Hamilton case here in Fredericton from 1949, and do more with that.
For me, probably I'll be back. One thing I'm thinking of doing is there's this really neat chapter of my doctoral dissertation on what they called polymorphians and calothumpians in the 19th century in St. John. They were like institutionalized versions of Charivaris, and they would parade through St. John at various celebrations. I never did anything with that, and it really says a lot about the construction of race, and they took great. A lot of the floats were actually very critical of city fathers and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of really neat ridicule in the vignettes on the floats and things. So I'm thinking maybe next summer of revisiting some of that old doctoral dissertation stuff and sending off something to Acadienses. But for the most part, I'm more of an 18th century person now. So I'm most interested in the Loyalists who resettled in the region. And of course, that takes me to St. John, the Black Loyalists and the enslaved who came as the property of white Loyalists. But I'm also chasing around an 18th century military engineer, British military engineer named William Booth, who was posted throughout the British Empire as part of his career. And essentially, I've found personal journals. So I'm still interested in diaries, right? Personal journals of his that range from when he was in Nova Scotia in 1789. Then he was in Gibraltar before that for the Great Siege, then Nova Scotia, post-Loyalist. Then he went back to Britain and served in some of the royal dockyards, and then to the Channel Islands. So essentially his personal diaries cover that entire period of roaming through the British Empire and trying to keep the empire together, essentially. So I'd like to write a book about that at some point. He was also a really good artist. So I'm finding all kinds of drawings, paintings, a sketchbook, lots of interesting stuff.
I'm also doing cannabis. That doesn't sound very,
Oh, yeah.
very good, but I'm also doing cannabis. I'm guest editing a special issue of the Journal of Canadian Studies that Greg knows about on cannabis in Canada and the cultural and critical perspectives on cannabis in Canada. So I'm not inhaling.
Well, my neighbor definitely is. When I mow the lawn in the back. So, well, partly asking, for academic reasons, but also we're always looking for future speakers. And I think you've just named 2 or 3 topics we can track you down on in the future. We're hoping at some point we'll get back to, in-person meetings in the New Brunswick Museum. But I mean, the numbers aren't huge here tonight, but this format does have some advantages because you have people who aren't in St. John. So maybe we can have some sort of hybrid in the future where we can have a Zoom presentation when we're doing our live talks, and who knows, right? But I guess we're all looking forward to getting back to some type of regular routine, whatever that might be in the fall. And so I'm just going to see if there's any more, maybe one last question from anyone. And I think you could also, most of us know the presenters anyway, you can always track them down by email. I just want to thank you again for a great presentation. I'm looking forward to digging into the book myself. Again, as I mentioned in chat, and as Mike and Bonnie know, my mother was born in Guildford Street. lived all our life on the west side pretty much, so it's in my blood. So we got some golden handshakes here. Just reminding people that next month, last Tuesday in July, I'll be speaking on a true crime case from 1914, St. John's Boy Bandit, which has a real surprise. I don't want to give too much away, but there's a real twist in that story. It didn't take place on the east side. It took place, or the west side. It took place in the old east end of St. John. And then the other thing I didn't mention, that Loyalist House, which we maintain, we're going to do a kind of partial openings as of July 15th, tours by appointment only. But we'll see what the rest of the summer presents to us in terms of going to a more fuller opening mainly. But like a lot of small museums, we're struggling and trying to get back to some sort of normal routine as well. So thanks, congratulations on the book, authors, and it's nice to see your parents again. Bonnie, I think they've come to your talks, and
Yes, they have.
yeah, I'm sure
They're great supporters.
Proud of both of you. So that's it, folks. I'm going to sign off for now. This is being recorded. We are going to post it on the YouTube channel for the Loyalist House in New Brunswick Historical Society.
Greg, could you send us that link
I
to
will.
once it's up?
Yeah, I will. Yeah,
Perfect, because I'll
yeah,
share it with the press, because they were keen to see this.
Good,
So
yeah.
perfect.
Yeah, and I can send you also the file, Mike. What's this I forget what format, MP4 or whatever, right?
Okay.
I can send you the actual file too, so in a Dropbox or something like that. But yeah, I'll send
Perfect.
it as soon as it transfers over. I'll try to load it up. And thanks again, folks.
All right.
Thank
stay
you.
safe.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
British Columbia, hope you cool off soon. Okay.
Good to see you, Moira.
Yeah.
Yes,
Bye,
wonderful
Mom.
to see you.
Bye, Dad.
Okay.
See you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Janet.
Bye.
Bye, Zach.
Goodbye.
Take care.
Bye, Catherine.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, Kurt.